Good morning, everyone. This is Andrea Copping with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Very pleased to invite you to this workshop on competing water use in the face of climate change. This is associated with our project known as the Integrated Analysis to Support Water Resource Planning for Extreme Events under Climate Change. The objectives for our workshop here today is our team has modeling projects to share with you that look at the extreme events that are related to water management and specifically sustainable fish habitat and other uses by humans. We are going to explore how these tools we have in hand can best be applied to your watershed. And we, as the project team, really hope to get your involvement and input on what information you're seeing here would be most useful to help you meet your management concerns. And also, what's the best format or method of delivery for that information so it'll be useful to you. Okay, the agenda for today's workshop. As you see here, we're doing some introductions. Right after this, we are going to ask you to share your top 2 management needs from your perspective as a water use manager or a fisheries manager. And you were given 2 index cards to write those on. We'll collect those and we'll share those later on. Then at 9:30, you're going to hear the first of a couple of presentations where our team will be talking about the kind of information we have, the sources of information we have for climate change, particularly as it threatens the management of watershed, fisheries, and other water uses. At 10 o'clock, we'll do a more in-depth introduction of the NOAA project and also our project team. And then after a break, you'll have a second set of presentations that really show you what the modeling tools we have for the meteorological, the hydrological, and estuarine models, and also how these relate to fish and other water use metrics. We'll have a question period, and then right before we have lunch, we're going to talk about how we're going to spend the afternoon in breakout groups. Immediately following lunch, you'll divide into one of 2 workout groups, and those have been indicated for you. We'll share that with you before lunch. You'll either be focusing on fish and fisheries or on other water uses. We'll do that for about an hour and a half. And then at 2:15, following a break, we'll have a report out from the 2 groups. And we'll wind up the day talking about the next steps in the project. This project, we are fortunate to have funded by the NOAA Climate Program Office. It's under a particular program called the Sectoral Applications Research Program, or SARP. As we said, this project is the Competing Water Use in the Face of Climate Change, an integrated analysis to support water resource planning for extreme events. The specific objectives of our project are to inform and improve climate change resilient resource management through increasing communication in the Puget Sound Basin. By this we mean we have some products, and those products can be tailored, but what we're most interested in is hearing what your needs are and what we can deliver to you. Through that process, we're going to develop a set of metrics as part of a decision support tool that will help understand these impacts of extreme events on water resources at selected locations, these particular watersheds. These metrics and this decision support tool will be built on existing Pacific Northwest National Laboratory and University of Washington capabilities and products. And those are based on the output of climate, hydrologic, and coastal models. These will be correlated with thresholds from regulations, guidelines, or else the values that you as water use managers have and need for your work. And the final objective of our project is to see how this can be used, not just in the watersheds we're discussing here today, but as transferability to other coastal watersheds. I'd like to present to you briefly our project team. Dr. Xiaoqing Yang here at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory is our chief coastal modeler. He's also the principal investigator of the project. I introduced myself before, Andrea Copping, and I work with Michaela Freeman on the overall outreach and engagement part of this project. Dr. Natalie Voisin and Ning Sun of Pacific Northwest National Laboratory are working on the hydrologic models. Dr. Guillaume Mauger of the Climate Impacts Group, University of Washington, is working on climate models and the connection to the hydrologic models. Dr. Amy Fullerton with Northwest Fisheries Science Center of NOAA is our fish expertise, working on fisheries metrics and the connection to the model output. Dr. Ian Miller works with Washington Sea Grant at the University of Washington. He's located out on the peninsula, the Olympic Peninsula, and is our liaison and expertise with the Dungeness watershed. And Dr. Jude Apple is at Padilla Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve and the Washington Department of Ecology. And Dr. Apple is playing that same technical and engagement role with the Skagit watershed. And here's the timeline for our project. You see that we started this project just a few months ago. We are here, of course, in the workshops in April and May of 2016. We will be doing further data inquiry and some more simulation analysis using the modeling tools and developing an initial framework for our decision support tool, or our metrics. Through the next 9 months or so, we will be interacting with stakeholders and working on these tools. The decision support tool will be ready in draft next winter, and we will coordinate with you and hold a webinar in the May to June timeframe. We'll be wrapping up this project and reporting back to NOAA and so on in the summer of 2018. Okay, next we're going to start a series of presentations on the sources of data on climate change and extreme events that will help drive the modeling analysis. Thank you.
Okay, hi, I'm Guillaume. My name is Guillaume Mauger. I'm a research scientist at the Climate Impacts Group at UW. And my role in this workshop is to illustrate how we come about, what's the modeling and work we do to produce some of our estimates of how climate change would impact folks like you. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about one specific example of some of the work we've been doing that might be of interest in this project. So, and I want to start with a little bit of a tangent, which is just this picture of Walmart, and this is neither farmland nor habitat, but it illustrates sort of where we could go with our projections. And so this is the Walmart on any normal day, and this is that same Walmart under the current, what the current FEMA model suggests is the 100-year flood elevation. This Walmart, when it was built, was actually not within the 100-year flood according to FEMA, but an update in their modeling suggests that it is because the levees aren't protecting it much. And this is the Walmart in the Mount Vernon near I-5, so not necessarily near Squim, but or the Dungeness watershed, but sort of illustrates the same idea. So what I want to talk about in my talk is how do we get to this point in our modeling, and what are we producing that might help get there? Okay, when I think about how climate change affects rivers and river deltas in the Northwest, I think of sort of the big drivers and sort of a very simple schematic like what you're seeing here. So, on the coastal side, the sorts of impacts that I would expect to see are something like sea level rise, surge, and waves. On the high elevation side, it's things like snowpack, landslides, sediment erosion, and how those affect stream flow. And then in between, we're all across the watershed. Warmer temperatures in the future are going to affect plants, water temperatures, habitat, and snowpack. And then a new piece of the research also is that our heaviest rain events are going to get more intense. So that's what I want to walk through in this slide. And where we start is with the global climate models. These are state-of-the-art models that model the whole globe and how the climate changes across decades into the future. And because they're state-of-the-art complex models, they're pretty coarse, so they can't tell us really much about how one town in our area is different from another nearby, or one particular piece of habitat is different from another. So we need to take that coarser scale data and bring it down to a scale where we can use it. And the term we use for that is downscaling. There's different ways of doing that, but basically you want that climate data at the global scale to be able to be brought down to the local scales where we can use it to look at impacts. Okay, so that's the first step. But then that often you want something other than temperature and precipitation. That's not always necessarily directly linked to the thing that you care about. So you might want to run some other model. And in our case, a lot of our focus is using hydrologic models to model changes in stream flow. And so those take changes in temperature and precipitation and run them through and work out the implications for snowpack and stream flow. And then we can look at how stream flow might change in the future. And then we probably have some ideas on the ground, and we're hoping to learn from you all today about what are the specific thresholds where there are major impacts, how often those have to happen, or how long they'd have to persist to cause a problem, and also some ideas about whether or not the current modeling and data is actually answering the questions you need to answer in your management, which would hopefully feed back into this other modeling so we can sort of improve over time. And we expect this process to sort of work like this in kind of this iterative loop where we're learning as we go. Okay, so that's kind of the process. I want to back up into one specific detail that's worth knowing about, which is greenhouse gas scenarios.
So with climate change, we're in the business of predicting the future, which understandably is not always easy. And in particular, one thing that we can't really predict is how humans will behave in the future. What will population growth be? What's going to be the future of geopolitics or inventions of some kind? So since we can't do that, and we don't, and those are important for understanding what greenhouse gas emissions will be in the future, we instead create greenhouse gas scenarios. And those are really just storylines. So they're sort of like what-if scenarios, where we say, what if population growth is, there's a lot of population growth over the 21st century? What if we continue to accelerate in burning fossil fuels? What does that look like? And we do ones that are in between and ones that are sort of the opposite. What if we really pull the brakes on greenhouse gas emissions? What if population growth plateaus really early in the century, maybe new technologies come online that facilitate that? And we know some things about the future. We know that we can't burn all the fossil fuels tomorrow in one day, and we know we can't turn them all off in terms of greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow either. And we have a good sense of like what is that range that's plausible. And so within that plausible range, we have greenhouse gas scenarios. And then there are what-if scenarios, because we run them through global climate models that then tell us if greenhouse gas emissions follow this path, those will tell us sort of what are the consequences as a result. So that's the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is global climate models. These are really sort of the state of the art in terms of how we know the climate works. The models are really not told much more than the fact that the Earth spins on its axis at an angle relative to its orbit around the sun, and that the continents are where they are and the ocean bodies are where they are. It figures out the rest. They figure out storms, the weather, they figure out ocean circulation, where the sea ice is, what the differences between the seasons and how the weather changes between those, and so on and so forth. So they're highly complex, sophisticated models, and because they are so complex, they can't be run at a fine scale over the whole globe at once. So they're usually run at a pretty coarse scale. We're talking sort of 50 to 100 miles in resolution. So they do great for telling us globally what's going on with the climate, but they don't work well for telling us locally how things might be different in the Dungeness than in the Skagit, for example. But before I start to talk about how we get those local changes in climate, I want to back up a little bit, stay at this higher level and talk about what those global models say about what we can expect in the future. So this is just showing in gray what the models have said about how climate has varied in the past, and that's been verified with observations and consistent with what we see in those. And then in those colored lines, it's what those global models say when you give them the greenhouse gas scenarios and ask how does temperature and precipitation change in the future. So there's really two main take-homes here, and the one is that annual average temperature, like temperature on any given day, is expected to increase significantly in the climate models. And the thing to notice there is that those plots show that variability. Not every year is the same. We've got warm and dry years and cold and wet years and so on and so forth. Those low-end cool years in the future are at the high end of the range. It's not outside of the range of what we've seen in the past. So with climate change, we're going in a totally different regime in terms of how much warmer it's going to get in the future. We're talking about upwards of 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit warming by the end of the century. That's the first point. The second point is that with precipitation, we really aren't seeing any change at all. one detail here is this is in terms of annual and seasonal precipitation. The recent research has shown that those big events, our big rain events in the winter, those are going to change much more rapidly than what you're seeing in this precipitation plot here, because this is just annual total precipitation. So that's the regional picture. How do we get to those local scale projections from that coarse scale climate information? So you can see what that coarse scale looks on the top right plot here. The way that we do that, the term we use is downscaling, that relates the large scale variations in climate from the global model to local scale changes that we can use to look at implications. And I don't want to get too into the technical details here. There's different ways of doing downscaling, and they have different advantages, and some are appropriate in some instances and others in others. Just to mention that is something that we look into and do a fair amount of research on. And then I'm nearing the end of my talk. I want to just mention one specific kind of impact that would be, I think, of interest to folks in this group, and one of the potential things that we could look at in this project after we've heard your thoughts at these workshops. And that's looking at changes in the intensity of heavy rain events. So I showed you that plot showing that for our region, annual average precipitation does not really change. The year-to-year fluctuations we see in precipitation are about the same in the past as they will be in the future. But that's only true for annual and seasonal precipitation or rainfall, but not true for those big events. The modeling really is clear that those big events are getting bigger, and we're doing some modeling that's wrapping up over the next couple of months that's quantifying exactly how much bigger that's getting. So this is just one example. This is an average for the region. It doesn't tell you how, for example, Seattle and Bellingham would see different impacts, but it does give you a ballpark number for what those numbers might look like. So if historically our biggest event we've ever seen was in a winter is 2 inches, we might see almost 2.5 inches for that big event by the end of the century. And we're also starting to look at that in ways, again, this is an example to sort of illustrate the sorts of things we could look at in this project that get a little bit closer to how you might use it in actual planning and design. And these are preliminary results. I want to caution against it, but this is just looking at rain intensity in a way that engineers often look at it in terms of design. It's called an intensity duration frequency curve. Some of you may be familiar with it. And it's just showing when you compare historical and the solid lines to the dashed lines across a lot of durations, that the intensity of precipitation is going up in all of those instances. So I will stop there, and we'll move on to hear from others about other things we could be looking at in terms of our modeling.
Good afternoon. My name is Nathalie Voisin. I'm a research scientist at the Pacific Northwest National Lab, and I'm also an assistant professor at the University of Washington. And I'm going to present some metrics on how we project water resource distribution over different basins. And this is something I would like to acknowledge as well my associate Nixon, who is also an hydrologist. So what Guillaume presented previously was how we are deriving climate change projection from the atmospheric side. And when it comes to the watershed part, we also combine it with topology and vegetation characteristics, which represent the basin. And then we use a hydrology model, which represent complex processes, evaporation and transpiration, complex processes on the slope. And then there is a river routing, which allow us to look at flow conditions in a spatially distributed way across the basin. So here we're presenting the Dungeness as an example. The output from the hydrology model can inform an estuary model, for example, which would be at the outlet of the basin, but it can also inform in a spatially distributed way, meaning here, for example, at many segments throughout the flow network, we can look at the mean monthly flow climatology, annual daily flood, stream temperature, and water quality. This information can be of use for cities, agriculture, environmental conservations, etc. Over the northwest, this is a region of complex terrain and vegetation, and we use the hydrology model called DHSVM, which stands for Distributed Hydrology Soil Vegetation Model. This model stands out for especially in the Northwest because of this spatial resolution, where usually we are at a grid cell of about 150 meters, and temporal resolution, which is about a 1 hour to 3 hourly time scale. It means that at those scales, we are able to represent very complex processes, meaning a large range of different vegetation type, a range of surface and subsurface processes, and each of the grid cell is connected so that we can route not only the surface runoff but also the subsurface flow. So this is to give you an example of the complex processes that we use and represent when we do climate change projection onto the water resources. This is also the same model that was used by the 2010 Washington State Climate Change Impact Assessment. The model was developed in coordination between the University of Washington and PNNL and is presently hosted by PNNL. So again, here it's just very important to present you the model to give you an idea of what to expect in terms of climate change projection and information that is readily available. So the previous hydrology modeling work that has been done over the Puget Sound area includes the impact of climate change and land use change on flow characteristics, the impact of climate change and land use change on stream temperature, and then the exploration of land use scenarios to mitigate climate change, in particular forest management practices or riparian shading, and urban hydrology, storm retention ponds, forest roads, water quality. And I'm putting here a couple of the academic publications, which we think that it might be some of the complex and challenge for decision makers to address and access this information, is that it's available in a format that might be difficult, but yet this is the information that is really readily available as of today over the Puget Sound Basin. And so in the next slides, what I'm going to do is actually show a couple of those applications in more details, so that you can understand, we can show and discuss what are the processes that are being presented, that are available, and so that we can foster discussions on your interest. What are the data that you need, and we can discuss together then how to get there, if this is readily available or if it needs further modeling. So the first application is a project that we had with the city of Everett. So this is over the Snoqualmie River Basin. And we were looking at how forest management could be used to, or could affect stream flow. And we worked with the city directly, and they provided a high spatial resolution vegetation map, like you see here over 2008. The yellow is the young forest, and the dark green is the old forest. And they provided, they created that other vegetation cover, which is all old growth, or actually it's a medium growth. And we focus here on the upper Snoqualmie, on the North Fork of the Snoqualmie. And we looked, and we decided together on which metrics to look at. And then we looked at the change in flow. So here, one of the hypotheses was how climate change is impacting the stream flow over this North Fork, and how a different vegetation cover and more forests could affect this change. So what we're looking at is the red one is, those are the historical flow simulation, the green one and blue one are the future flow simulation under climate change. The dark colors are for the current land use, and the light color is for the hypothetical mature forest. And what we worked on together was looking at this shift in seasonality, where climate change is driving this hydrograph with a 2 peak going into a 1 peak flow, so from rain-snow transition to rain control. However, we could also look at the effect of that different forest and how it was affecting in the systematic biases all of the winter and the spring flow. So here the metric that we looked at was the monthly hydrograph, and really we were focusing on the seasonal shift. Another metrics that we looked at, and on those little table here, I have actually that list of metrics that we looked at. Here we focus on the daily extremes, and again looking at the impact of climate change, which is projected to increase that daily extreme. However, with the very daily extreme, it's really climate change that is driving that change, and not the change in vegetation. So but again here what was important was to look and decide on the metrics together. Another application that we have is stream temperature. So here what I want to show in terms of the availability of data and availability of variables that we'll look at is flow and stream temperature. So what we're looking on the left is the Puget Sound area, with the dark color being the water body. So we had a couple of about 15 basins, and the flow on the right are presenting the basins that are on the western Puget Sound area, and they go from rain dominated to snowmelt dominated. And we just want to demonstrate how the model is performing, with the solid lines being the flow and the dots being the stream temperature, and just looking at how we reproduce the seasonality, which is going to be important, and it could be one of the type of metrics that you may be interested in. So again, here we can associate flow and stream temperature. Another application here was to look at again at the combined effect of change in land use and climate change, and evaluate metrics, but this time at the basin scale. And we're also looking at the ability of the model to look for specific policy. For example, here we're looking at the ability of riparian vegetation. So for example, it's when you create a corridor of high vegetation around the streams. And so we're looking at the flow with and without that riparian vegetation, when the total basin used to have forest, and now it's cities or just shrubs and grass. Important to look at is here again we can look at the effect of stream temperature and the effect of riparian shading. I just wanted to discuss what was available and how we can use the models. There are metrics that are at the basin scales, but for specific stakeholders, it might be more important to have metrics that are spatially distributed, where you are interested in, for example, looking at metrics that would be consistent throughout the entire stream. So here with this model, we are also able to look at the entire stream network. So here again, we're looking at the Puget Sound area, and we were able with this application to identify what was the effect of climate change, and so an overall warming of the stream, but what would be the effect or the mitigation of climate change when people are using restoration of riparian shading, which tends to have a cooling effect. So this is it for those applications, to really demonstrate what if you don't find it directly in the application or in the literature, this is what the models can do. So then we would like to discuss on what is readily available, or what is can be done through more modeling, and understand the spatial resolution and discuss together different metrics.
Hello, my name is Zhao Qingyang. I'm from the Marine Sciences Laboratory, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. I'm a scientist in the Coastal Ocean Modeling Group, and I'm also the PI of this project. Today I'm going to talk about the modeling estuary hydrodynamics response. Today I'm going to talk about modeling estuary hydrodynamic response to climate change and extreme events. So when we talk about the impact of climate change extreme events on estuary process, three types of process are important to consider. The first is windstorm. The other is sea level rise because of global warming. And the third one is river flood, drought, and also warm temperature discharge into the estuary. So windstorm and sea level rise will cause a storm surge and coastal inundation, and also cause excessive sediment transport and has impact on the coastal infrastructure. As for river drought and flood and warm temperature discharge into the estuary, it will cause temperature and salinity change in the estuary regimes. Also shift the saltwater intrusion points in the estuary because of extreme low or high flows. And of course, because of temperature change, it will affect the fish habitat areas. So next, I'm going to show you a few slides on how we can use a hydrodynamic model to address the climate change impacts on the estuary. So this is a slide shows the high resolution CLC hydrodynamic model developed by PNNL. So the hydrodynamic model of CLC takes the input of tides and sea level at the open boundaries, also river flows from all the tributaries which discharge into the Puget Sound or CLC basin. And it also considers atmospheric forcing, which include the wind and the pressure and also heat flux. So the two insets showing on the right bottom corner are the zoom in grid model grid points and also bathymetry. So you can see the model has a very high resolution in the estuary and can describe the very details of the geometry and the change of dikes and all the infrastructure. So next slide shows the simulated flow trace in CLC. It includes, of course, the Puget Sound basin and the subbasin and Strait of Juan de Fuca and Georgia Strait. And you can see the flow pattern in the CLC is very complicated, and you can see a lot of eddies forming because of tidal action and also the complex geometry features. This slide shows a zoom-in simulated tidal currents in the eastern Strait of Juan de Fuca and Admiralty Inlet and part of the San Juan Islands. Again, you can see very strong current in the Admiralty Inlet and also along the Rosario and Harrow Strait. So this is the type of information that is important for us to use to understand hydrodynamics in the CLC and also used to address some of the impact in the estuary and especially in the floodplain areas. This slide shows the simulated salinity distribution in the Woodbine Basin. In particular, you can see the light blue color represent the freshwater plume discharge from Skagit River, Still-Quamish River, and the Snohomish rivers. The brownish color actually represent the tide flats area. So during low tide, you can see the tide flats actually exposure, and this is the area is very important for fish migration. So as shown in the two image on the right, and those are the sturgeon actually got trapped in the tidal creek during low tide. So to be able to accurately simulate the hydrodynamics as well as salinity and the temperature plume in the estuary region is very important. And if we want to look at the impact of climate change, such as the low flow condition and also warm temperature conditions. This slide shows the comparison of simulated surface temperature in the Salton Sea for winter and the summer conditions. So, and you can see the river discharge actually have a very important effect on the surface temperature, especially near the estuary, mouth of the estuary. So you can also see in the summer condition, the temperature, of course, it's much warmer than the winter conditions. So this slide shows, again, another example of a simulated salinity in the Snohomish River, but it also considers the effect of climate change on the river discharge. And the right panel shows the response of salinity intrusion point from a distance from the right panel shows the right panel shows the salt intrusion point in the Snohomish River, corresponding to river inflow under extremely low and also high river conditions. So you can see under low river conditions, the salinity intrusion point actually is pushing much upstream, and during high river flow, the salinity intrusion actually is being pushed much further down of the river mouth. Actually, it's become negative relative to the river mouth. So this type of information, again, is very important in terms of addressing the river inflow on the this type of information is very important to. Okay, I'm going to restart on this slide. Okay. So this slide shows the simulated salinity in the Snohomish River. So the two image on the left shows the salinity distribution under low flow and the high flood condition. And you can see during the low flow condition, salinity actually is intrusion is much further upstream. But under flood condition, and you can see the fresh water actually push much further downstream. And the right panel shows the salinity intrusion point relative to the mouth of the estuary, indicated in the vertical axis as 0. So the four tributary mainstream, unit through, steamboat through, and the epi through. So each tributary, the response, as you can see, is very, very different. So under high flow condition, you can see all the salinity intrusion point actually merge together and being pushed all the way down to the estuary. But during low flow condition, the salinity intrusion point for each tributaries are quite different. And as indicated in the epi through, the salinity intrusion point is being pushed much, much further upstream. So that's all of my presentation, and thank you very much.
Hi, this is Amy Fullerton. I'm with the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, which is a part of NOAA Fisheries in Seattle. And my role on this team is going to be to think about how extreme climate events could influence Pacific salmon, focusing on metrics of freshwater and estuarine conditions, for example, flow and temperature. It's well established that conditions are going to become more stressful for fish in the future with climate change, with warmer temperatures, potentially wetter winters and drier summers. And there's plenty of predictions about expected mean changes. What our goal in this project, as you've heard already, is to focus on the extreme climate events. So, for example, in 2015, there was a drought on the Pacific coast in a lot of the coastal watersheds. So temperatures in the summer were quite warm, and there was pretty low flows throughout the year, especially in the summer, and there was a kind of a snow drought. So just as an example of that, I'm showing you some data from the Snoqualmie River watershed. And on the top is discharge, and you can see the red line there is discharge, and the blue is your more recent past. You can see it was pretty low discharge. And then on the bottom is water temperature in the main stem, and you can see that it is exceeding the state standards that they've set for fish. And we're expecting to see a lot more years like 2015 more often in the future. So just as an example of how fish may respond to extreme climate events, we looked at outmigration of 4 different species from the Columbia River following that anomalous climate year in 2015. So all the species that smolted in 2016 that had spent their freshwater in 2015 came out earlier than they had in previous years. So we don't really know yet what the consequences of this will be, of fish coming out and getting to the estuary too early. There could be mismatches in prey availability. There could be more predators, etc. So here's an example from Wade et al. A couple years ago of a vulnerability analysis for steelhead at an intermediate spatial scale. It's a good example of how people tend to think about measuring the effects of climate change. On the top, we think a lot about changes in temperature and changes in flow. But I really wanted to point out in the bottom, they've got a couple of examples that are really a little more tailored to extreme events and specifically tailored to steelhead and specific life stages for steelhead. So we want to do something similar to this, but at a watershed scale, and focusing on the species and the life stages that you believe are important to capture. So here are some potential impacts of extreme climate events on salmon from our project proposal. This list isn't inclusive of all possibilities, and part of the goal of this workshop is to identify the areas that are most important for your watershed. So there are different concerns during different seasons. For example, during winter, concerns focus on development of eggs incubating in the gravel, whether warmer temperatures may alter biological rates, and whether floods may scour the redds that the eggs are in. Whereas during summer, concerns focus on juvenile rearing and migration conditions, whether warmer temperatures and extreme low flows reduce habitat quality and therefore growth and survival. And potential effects of extreme climate events are likely to differ among species and among life stages. For instance, in the upper graph on the left, high water temperatures coincide more with the migration of steelhead than for other species. And down looking at the lower right, low flows can coincide more with habitat use by juveniles that spend their summers in freshwater, like spring chinook and steelhead, and not shown here, but also coho. More so than species like fall chinook or chum or pink, for example. The effects of temperature and flow on fish are going to depend on spatial and temporal scales, and we need to be really honest about the scales at which our data and models are good enough for answering particular questions. So, for example, if we have really high resolution data, over temporal and spatial scales, we could focus down in the lower corner and develop metrics like to look at refuge use, how close together are cold refuges, for example, and development rates. But if we don't have data at that high resolution, then maybe we need to focus more on some questions that we can answer, like movement throughout whole river reaches over seasons or years, or growth, survival, phenology, population diversity, etc. So that's really going to depend on the kind of data that we have available to use. So there are many ways to summarize flow and thermal regimes, and people have been thinking about this for a long time, starting with the indices of hydrologic alteration for flow back in the late 90s, and then more recently similar approaches to describing thermal regimes. But essentially we can look at different metrics of magnitude, duration, timing, frequency, and rate of change. And maybe we want a couple of those. Maybe just one isn't going to capture sort of everything that we're interested in. So once we identify critical periods, for instance, seasons or life stages, etc., for the fish, we need to identify a small suite of metrics for evaluating how these will change over time and over space. And here I'm showing you examples for how we might measure extreme flow events and their effects on salmon. So for instance, during the winter, we might be more interested in metrics of extreme peak flows or flooding events, whereas during the summer, we might be more interested in measuring really hot water temperature, or pardon me, not water temperature, I'm talking about flow here, really low flows. So maybe the first date where the flows go below a certain threshold, or how long they stay that low, etc. And now I'm talking about water temperature, just as another couple of examples to get us thinking, whether we go for flow or water temperature, or what we go for. But here in the summertime, thinking, maybe the first date the temperature gets over a certain threshold, or how long it stays there, would be a good metric for capturing something during the summer, whereas during the winter, maybe we're more interested in variability or elevated minimum temperatures, etc. And we can look at similar things for estuaries as we can for freshwater. Next slide. So there's a lot of different metrics that we can measure, and each metric is going to tell a different story. So on the top is a graph of water temperature for two different rivers that both have a similar mean over the year, but you can see that there's different seasonal patterns and even different daily patterns. And on the bottom are some matrices that illustrate that some metrics are really highly correlated. So maximum and mean, for example, would be really highly correlated, but others aren't nearly as correlated, and that the strength of those correlations differs between seasons. And here I'm showing another example of how metrics can differ, just looking at this spatially. So on the top, we're showing mean temperatures during the summer and the winter, and you can see that the patterns are very similar in that there's warmer temperatures down in the main part of the river and cooler temperatures in the headwaters. But if we look at a different metric, in this case variance, you can see that the patterns are quite different. So things that are very variable in the summertime can be pretty stable in the winter, and vice versa. And these have biological implications. So fish, fortunately, can respond to warm temperatures during migration and other time periods by moving into cool water habitat. So this graph is an example from some of Matt Kiefer's work showing the internal temperature of fish, and that's the colors there. And the gray is the gray color illustrates the main river temperature, the Columbia River, as these fish are migrating up. So when things get to be above about 20 degrees, you can see that the fish are pulling off into cooler tributary habitats. And so maybe that gives us a clue about a good metric that we might want to use during upstream migration, for example. Maybe it's the number of days over 20 degrees C, for example, or how many times it gets that hot, how long it lasts, etc. And then thinking more about these things in estuaries, here's an example from some colleagues of mine, Jason Hall and others, in the Snohomish River, where they looked at the interaction of salinity with flows and classified these into different, oligohaline or saline environments. So on the left is an extremely low flow condition, and the salinity is quite high. And on the right, there's a lot more freshwater discharge coming out into the estuary, and so the salinity can be quite different. So these strong seasonal and annual variations in salinity can be based on hydrology, and they can affect the fish as they're moving through these systems. And obviously temperature changes in the estuary as well. So you can see some really strong seasonal and annual variation, particularly in the times that salmon are present, say during February through August, that will affect their rearing duration and growth. So really, I just wanted to illustrate a couple of examples of different metrics that we might be interested in trying to capture in this project, and just give you some fodder to be thinking about when we go into the breakout sessions later on. But these are the two questions that I want you to be thinking about